Appreciate your being back. Excuse me. Appreciate your being back to study the book of Isaiah with us again in this session. If you will, please be turning to chapter 7 as we're going to we're going to continue our discussion. Excuse me, I have a frog in my throat today. We're going to continue our discussion there of chapter 7, verse 14 is the key point we're looking at. But we're looking at chapter 7 being such a vital part of what we see. And you'll remember from our last lesson that we looked at the history of the background that we see. And we saw, of course, that Tiglath-Pileser III had become king of Assyria. And immediately he started out in an aggressive campaign to expand the borders of Assyria. And so the kings of Syria and Israel had joined together in an alliance to try to stand against him, and then they sought to have Ahaz join them in that alliance. Well, he refused to do so and immediately began to be attacked from all areas. Again, remember, we called that the Syro-Ephraimitic War, is the historical name for what we see there in the text. Well, he was attacked, and in his mind, there was only one way for him to go. It was the wrong way. What he should have done, as we see through so many other references, is that he should have looked to God to help in that time. It's also important for us to remember that Ahaz represents the Davidic line. He's one king of that one dynasty of kings in the history of the two southern tribes there of Judah, the nation of Judah. And God had promised on numerous occasions that if we would just stay faithful, if they would just stay faithful, that God would care for them during that time and he would protect them. Well, rather than do that, Ahaz decided that he would just form an alliance, or he would submit to Tiglath-Pileser III of Syria. He would get them to take care of things. And on the surface, it looked like it might be a good decision, because immediately when he started paying his tribute to Assyria, that Assyria started attacking those nations that were involved coming against Ahaz. Well, in our context here of chapter 7, specifically there, when we look at verses 1 through 9, we see that plot against King Ahaz. We've already indicated that Syria and Israel had become allies. And here we have the only mention of Isaiah's son, Shear-Jashub, is referenced, and they're to go meet Ahaz and talk to him. And apparently he was by the conduit, the pool where their water supply was. If he was under siege, if he was being attacked, that would be a natural thing to do, would be to make sure that the water supply was okay. It was within the gates to protect it for that very reason. And then he was given 4 commands. Remember, 2 of them were positive, 2 of them are negative. And the negative were just a restatement of the first in a different way. First of all, he says, take care and be calm. Positive. Then he said, have no fear and don't be faint-hearted. So in a positive and negative way, he's trying to encourage Ahaz for what he needed to do. Well, remember that Syria and Israel were determined to capture Judah. They were determined to take down Ahaz, and they were going to put a puppet king in his place, and that king's name was Tabel, T-A-B-E-L. And as I mentioned last week or last time, this is the only time in Scripture that he's even referenced. Think for a moment again about what that would do. I want to call your attention to that. Remember in Genesis 49:10, the promise that the scepter would not depart from Judah by fulfillment until Christ came. David was in essence told the same thing in 2 Samuel chapter 7. He was given the promise that God would protect that line. Ahaz should have known that. He was of the line of David. That would not have been new information to him. But let's also remember, he was between that proverbial rock and a hard place. And he saw no way out because he didn't look up. He looked north to Assyria, but he didn't look up and see God and see how God would have helped him through that time. This was a message. This was a threat to the Davidic dynasty. I want us to carry that thought in when we start looking now at the next section, verses 10 through 17. If that line were broken, Satan would have won. Because the Davidic line would have been broken and God's promise would have been broken if that was the case. And so what we see when we move into this next section is Ahaz was told to ask God for a sign, and Ahaz refused. And so he was given one. And that sign that was given, and the fact that it was given to Ahaz, has caused a lot of difficulty among scholars today. It's become much more simple to me when I consider two things, and I want to discuss those in more detail as we move down through this line. So let's go ahead and read verses 10 through 17 together as we continue our study. Moreover, the Lord spoke again to Ahaz, saying, Ask a sign for yourself from the Lord your God. Ask it either in the depth or in the height above. But Ahaz said, I will not ask, nor will I test the Lord. Then he said, Hear now, O house of David, is it a small thing for you to weary men, but will you weary my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Curds and honey he shall eat, that he may know to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child shall know to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land that you dread will be forsaken by both her kings. The Lord will bring the king of Assyria upon you and your people and your father's house, days that have not come since the day that Ephraim departed from Judah. So we'll look at this section now. So understanding now the historical context, understanding what Ahaz did, now we're going to see a little bit more detail about that discussion between Isaiah and Ahaz as it relates to that sign. Now, verse 10 shows us another important part. One of the powerful things about these prophets and the messages that they brought, over and over again, they manifested, they declared that the message was not theirs. This wasn't their opinion. This wasn't their view. This wasn't their thoughts. This is God's message that is being addressed. The prophet, the true prophet, is God's spokesman. And we see that point being made again. Moreover, the Lord spoke again to Ahaz, saying, but it was Isaiah talking. And the concept is understood there that Isaiah was speaking as God's representative to Ahaz. He's speaking God's word. Isaiah did not just speak about God. A powerful point to understand is he also spoke for God. Verse 11. So Isaiah said, Ahaz, ask for a sign. The refusal of Ahaz to do so, again, his words are, I will not ask, verse 11, or verse 12, nor will I test the Lord. Why did he not want to ask for a sign? The answer that seems obvious to me is he really didn't want to hear what God had to say. He had made up his mind. He thought that partnering with Assyria was the way to deal with this. And in essence, his mind was made up. He was going to pay tribute. He would much rather pay tribute than he would face attacks from all these different areas. And he thought maybe he was buying some allegiance on the part of Assyria. We're going to see that that simply is not true. We're going to see that you're looking at a tyrant in the form of Tiglath-Pileser, and he's going to do what he sees best for him or for the kingdom. At this time, yes, I'll take the tribute money of Ahaz, and I'll go and stop these little skirmishes that they're dealing with. But later on, the plans will change. I couldn't help but think about Jacob's accusation against Laban toward the end, when he accused him of changing his wages 10 times. The Christian doesn't do that. The child of God doesn't do that. The word is the bond. But Ahaz is not dealing with a good man. He's dealing with a pagan. And he's dealing with one in the person of Tiglath-Pileser III that is going to bring difficulty later. Keep that in mind as we move through. Now, the word for sign here in this context, verse 11, has been translated as miracle, and it's also been translated as plague, and it occurs 11 times in the book of Isaiah alone. Isaiah, in essence, says there's nothing too big. There's no challenge too great for God. Seek his help is what he was trying to get him to do. Trying to get Ahaz to ask God to show him a sign as to what to do. And for me, the only reason not to do that is because you already have your mind made up. You've already made your choice as to where you're going to go. He had no intention at this time of obeying God's will. So we move into verse 13. The phrase house of David recalls God's promise to David again. Now, we've referenced those two passages. We've done so often through Old Testament studies because those are so key as it relates to the understanding of Christ as the Messiah who's going to be coming to take David's throne. That's the promise David was given. And so Isaiah referred to Ahaz in this way. Then he said, Isaiah, hear now, O house of David, is it a small thing for you to weary men, but will you weary my God also? He was chastising Ahaz for failing to go and ask God about what to do. David's descendant was going to reign over Jerusalem. They were going to continue for some time. But ultimately, as we get down to verse 14, we're going to see quite simply that it's messianic in nature. Well, Ahaz refused, but was given a sign anyway. Verse 14, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Now, I've got a lot to say about that, but I want to wait till I get through the end of chapter 7, even if that takes us into next week. I want to wait. I want to spend a little bit more time there in Isaiah 7 because we're going to be looking at some other biblical principles as well as it relates to our better understanding this. It was a sign in Isaiah's day. It was a promise. It was a pledge. God was pledging something to Ahaz. That line's not going to be broken. But also it was a messianic prophecy that was going to show to be fulfilled in Christ and his ascension to David's throne and with that authority. Now, before that child, now there are those, I will go ahead and give you a teaser here because there are those who believe that this is what's seen as a dual fulfillment. That it was talking about a child in this day and it was talking about a child in application. We know it's application because Matthew 1 quotes it and applies it to Christ. But in essence, what he's saying is before Christ comes, these kingdoms are going to fall. God's judgment, his wrath is going to be poured out long before Christ ever gets here. But you see very figurative language being used to make that picture known. 13 years after the Syro-Ephraimitic War, Israel fell, 722 BC, to Assyria. Instead of trusting in God, however, Ahaz was trying to do things by his own power. And here's a point of application I made in class with the guys this week. Note how often we get into trouble the history we've had, and the present. When we think we know better than God how to do things, and when we just step out and do things without prayer, without study, we seem to look more to the nations around us. Remember, they're at the end of the time of Judges. Give us a king like the nations around us is what they asked for. They already had a king. Their king was God. Samuel was told, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. So we didn't originate the practice. But when we look at a lot of the innovations that are occurring in worship today, it's not from fresh Bible study. It's not from opening our heart to God in prayer. I have no doubt that they pray. But when we see introduction of instrumental music into worship, when we see the Lord's Supper being observed on a day other than the first day of the week, that does not come from Bible study. You cannot, I'll challenge you, you cannot study the New Testament and find authority for the use of instrumental music. You've got to look elsewhere. And so what do? We see people who are looking at other religious groups around them, and they're seeing things that look fun and it looks exciting. We have at least 2 congregations in the Fort Worth area that have introduced a worship on Saturday evenings where they observe the Lord's Supper, and it's instrumental in nature. I've seen both of them on video. Both times they said, after much prayer and study of the Bible, we've decided to do this. I don't like to call people liars. That's a hard word. I will say at the very least, they are sadly mistaken if they're believing that the New Testament itself authorizes those things. And I challenge people to see the real source of their doing those things. The punishment of unbelievers, verses 18 through 25. And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord will whistle for the fly that is in the farthest part of the rivers of Egypt, and for the bee that is in the land of Assyria. They will come, and all of them will rest in the desolate valleys and in the clefts of the rocks, and on all thorns and in all pastures. In the same day the Lord will shave with a hired razor, with those from beyond the river, with the king of Assyria, the head and the hair of the legs, and will also remove the beard. It shall be in that day that a man will keep alive a young cow and 2 sheep. So it shall be from the abundance of milk they give that he will eat curds. For curds and honey everyone will eat who is left in the land. It shall happen in that day that wherever there could be 1,000 vines worth 1,000 shekels of silver, it will be for briars and thorns. With arrows and bows men will come there, because all the land will become briars and thorns. And to any hill which could be dug with the hoe, you will not go there for fear of briars and thorns, but it will become a range for oxen and a place for sheep to roam. He's talking about the destruction of the land. In verses 18 and 19, Isaiah was referring to the so-called allies of Judah, those alliances with other nations. Egypt would never be counted on for help, although they would continue to try to do that, right on into the Maccabean period, right on into the time after Malachi wrote. It was just a temptation. They were close, they were powerful. And notice you've got Israel, Judah, Assyria, you've got Syria, you've got Egypt, you've got the Philistines, you've got the Edomites, you've got so many people around. And Judah just kind of bounced around like a pinball, back and forth, trying to seek alliances, and they never worked because it was never the right idea. It was never the appropriate thing to do to seek out those alliances. Assyria is going to prove to be a fierce enemy. These 2 nations manifest the same characteristics of swarming insects. That's the usage. Those insects being described there are those enemies that they're going to have, those solutions, supposed solutions that never worked. Verse 20 speaks about a hired razor. That again is alliances with other nations. Assyria was not going to help Judah out of the goodness of their heart. They weren't going to look at Syria and Israel and the Philistines and the Edomites and others. They weren't going to look at them and say, well, let's just step in and help these little guys. I kind of feel sorry for them. That's not the case. When you read the book of Habakkuk, the main difficulty that Habakkuk has is understanding God using heathen nations to bring about his will. Who did God use to bring Israel down, the 10 northern tribes? He used Assyria. They were a hired razor in that sense. Who was it that was eventually going to bring Judah down? The tribes of Benjamin and Judah. He's going to use Babylon. Habakkuk struggled with how God could use a heathen nation to do his will. And that book describes that very thing. And it's the providence of God. God does not nudge Assyria or Babylon toward their work. But in his seeing all of history as happening at one and the same time and having that omniscience, he knew what each was going to do, and he orchestrated his plan through all of that. And we just see too many powerful examples of the fulfillment of prophecy to deny God's work in these things. We've seen Joseph recognize providence. We saw that Mordecai recognized providence. Isaiah is going to pinpoint one for us in chapter 44, where he's going to prophesy of the Cyrus who is going to come, who's going to make it possible for the remnant to come back into the land. Now, this might be a good time to discuss that as well. One might think that with the 10 northern tribes carried into Assyria, the 2 southern tribes carried into Babylon, that it's over, that God's plan failed. That's simply not the case, because Isaiah is going to focus on that remnant that's going to keep coming back in. And we're going to see that in chapters to come, sections to come, as it relates to even in the darkest of days. And I was just talking to John just before coming in here this afternoon. Isaiah is a tough book to study because it's like a roller coaster. Boom, 5 chapters of judgment and punishment. Chapter 6, a bright, brilliant passage of Isaiah's call. Chapter 7, the promise of Messiah coming. Chapter 8, dark and gloomy again. And we're going to see that throughout the book. Oh, in coming chapters, even in this book of Emmanuel, chapter 7 through 12, we're going to see another powerful prophecy in chapter 9, verses 6 and 7. We're going to see another powerful prophecy in chapter 11. And it's fascinating that God is showing them what's going to happen because of their lack of faith, because of their sin. Yet even in these dark moments, we see the promise of better things to come. Let's bring this up into our time. We're living in a time that I'm more and more concerned about people. I guess the nicest way I can say that is this country's going nuts right now with all the riots and the revolts and the language that we hear being used of conspiracies. And I'm getting so tired of it. But this world is not our home. We're just passing through. Our treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. And that's what we need to see, and that's what Isaiah was showing. Yes, it's hard. You've sinned, and you have coming to you what's going to happen to you. That's going to be part of his message through the book. But through all of that, there's still hope. Hope is what enables us to get through any difficult situation we might face. And even today, it's been so sad to see people who have been affected by COVID, to those who have family members, and we have members ourselves of those who really struggled through that. And I'm glad to see so much improvement there. But if all I had to base my well-being on was the current events in society, this would be a dangerous place and it would be a scary proposition. But the same message that was told to Ahaz to look up and see God was the same message we have today. Let's look up. Let's quit this nonsense. Let's quit the bickering and the arguing with one another. And let's get back to work on our mission. And let's get back to the worship and the love and the devotion, the relationship we have with our Father, and the promise that we have, if found faithful, that we'll have a home with Him in the end. Well, the hired razor is going to come and shave off the beard, shave off the hair. And that was a way of showing shame in that culture. That language depicted that. Verses 21 and 22 paints the same picture that we saw back in chapter 5. Now let's step back there just a minute. Chapter 5, you've got the song of the vineyard, or the parable of the vineyard, depending upon the translation that you use. I have no problem seeing it as a parable. It makes sense. And so you're looking at a vineyard, and the owner of the vineyard, the worker in the vineyard, did everything he could do to bring about a bountiful harvest. Everything was put in place. The grapes had been planted, they'd been cared for, they had been nurtured. And so what the expectation was a nice, sweet, beneficial harvest of grapes. But that's not what happened. Rather than a nice, sweet, bountiful harvest, it was sour grapes that came in. It was expected because everything that could be done to bring about that bountiful harvest had been done. But it was an unexpected failure, and so therefore it's depicted as briars, as junk, as a wasteland. Yes, that's talking about God and Judah. God had done everything possible for him to do to bring Israel into and stay in a faithful relationship with him. But they refused. What more could he have done, we might ask? And the answer is nothing. Again, I don't believe that we truly understand the message unless we can make application today. We are living in a world that is lost and dying in sin but for the largest part. And it's not God's fault. God's done everything he could do. For God so loved the world. Who in the world? Everyone in the world. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, John chapter 3, verse 16, that whoever believes in him shall have eternal life. Brethren, the harvest is going to be few as it relates to us today. It was only 8 souls in the days of Noah. I don't know how many we're going to see, but in contrast to the number of people who have lived and will live, the vast majority are vile and worldly, rejecting God. God could not have done anything else to provide a bountiful harvest than what he's done through the sacrifice of his Son and the preaching of the gospel. The death, burial, resurrection of Christ makes it all possible. Well, agriculture, going back into our text and finishing up, we've got about a minute. Agricultural activity had vanished because of the devastation of that land. So few people were left that they would only have natural products to eat. Oh, they could have had a great harvest. They could have had bountiful, large amounts of a variety of vegetables and foods and breads and all of those things, but it's not going to happen. They're going to be besieged. Judah is going to be carried away into Babylonian captivity for 70 years. When you look at Israel being carried away, they're never going to be the nation of Israel again. And in fact, the nation of Judah will never be the nation of Judah again. It'll be a remnant that represents Judah. But from this time forward, right on through the end of the 1st century AD, they're under somebody else's control. And somebody else owns that land. Verses 23 to 25, again, the devastation of the land of Judah is depicted. Where valuable vines had once grown, now there's only briars and thorns. Where crops had been cultivated, that would be seen as a place where oxen are pastured and where sheep trample the ground. Israel and Judah are both going to be destroyed because of their sin. I want to thank you for joining us again. When we come together next time, we'll look at that little bit of information. I want to focus again on chapter 7, verse 14, because that is such a key point here. And then we'll pick back up as we have time with chapter 8 as we move along. Until next time, God bless you.